Welcome to lecture The Grade of International Financial Management. In the previous lecture, we discussed how international trade was done in historic times. We also understood the emergence of gold standard from gold species and gold coin standard. We also reflected on the pros and cons of gold standard. Today, I am going to take you through a very interesting journey: how the international monetary system evolved over time. We will start from the gold standard, move through the world wars and the Great Depression, and then understand how the Bretton Woods system was created and why finally it collapsed. Let us begin from the beginning. We had a gold standard era from 1870 to 1914. Then we had an interwar period, 1918 to 1939, which was followed by Great Depression. And then we created Bretton Woods system, which ultimately collapsed. Before the First World War, most countries in the world were following something called the gold standard. Under this system, each country's currency was directly linked to gold. This meant that if you had currency, you could convert it into a fixed amount of gold. Because of this, the supply of money in the economy was limited by how much gold a country can have. As a result, prices remained stable and international trade became easier because of exchange rates were fixed. However, this system started facing problems when the First World War began in 1914. War is very expensive. Governments suddenly needed huge amount of money to buy weapons, pay soldiers, and support their economies. But their gold reserves were limited, so they could not stick to the rule of converting currency into gold. What did they do then? They started printing money, more money. Now, this extra money was not backed by gold. So, naturally, the supply of money increased, but the supply of goods did not increase at the same pace. This led to inflation. Prices started rising and the value of money started falling. At the same time, because of political tensions and war conditions, it became difficult to move gold from one country to another. So many countries temporarily stopped converting their currency into gold. Slowly, the gold standard began to break down. Now, let us look at what was happening with the United States during this time. United States stayed away from war initially. Thus, United States was less affected by the war economically because it entered late in the war. In fact, it benefited from the war considerably because of trade surplus. It was able to sell goods and weapons to the nations who were engaged in the war. As a result, gold started flowing into the United States. The US accumulated large gold reserves and its currency, the dollar, became stronger. On the other hand, European countries like Britain, France, and Germany faced economic problems and their currencies weakened significantly. The currencies that experienced significant devaluation included those of the major European powers involved in the war, such as the British pound, German mark, French franc, while some currencies totally crashed. So, by the end of the war, we will see a shift. The United States emerging as a strong economic power, while Europe becomes weaker. The US dollar was viewed as stable and reliable. It had the largest gold reserves and its economy was relatively unharmed by the war. Now comes the interwar period, which means the period between the First and the Second World War, that is 1918 to 1939. It was marked by economic mismanagement, protectionism, and competitive currency devaluation. During this time, many countries tried to go back to the golden standard. For example, United Kingdom returned to the golden standard in 1925 at the same value that existed before the war. But the decision was not appropriate because economic conditions had changed. The prices had changed, wages and economic strength were no longer the same as before the war. Then came the Great Depression in 1929, which made the situation even worse. During the Depression, economies were shrinking, businesses were closing, and unemployment was rising. Ideally, government should have increased money supply to support the economy. When the economy is shrinking, the main problem is low demand. People are not spending, businesses are not investing, and production starts falling. Increasing the money supply helps revive the economy. By making more money available in the system, it lowers interest rates and encourages borrowing, and finally boosting the spending and investment activities. Government can also directly stimulate the economy by printing money and using it to finance development projects such as infrastructure, where they pay wages to the workers and purchase raw materials. This creates income in hand of the people, increases demand, encourages business to produce more and hire workers, leading to overall economic recovery. However, during the gold standard period, governments could not increase money supply freely because it was tied to gold reserve. Since they lacked sufficient gold and their currencies were already weak, expanding money supply risked losing confidence in the currency. As a result, they were unable to stimulate the economy effectively, which made the downturn much more severe. They could not freely expand money supply because it had to be backed by gold. As a result, the recession became deeper and more severe. Countries then started taking desperate measures. They imposed tariff to reduce imports. They controlled capital movements. These policies are known as beggar thy neighbors policies, meaning each country was trying to improve its own condition at the expense of the others. The result was disastrous. International trade collapsed, and by 1936, the gold standard was completely abandoned by all major economies. An economist named Kindleberger later explained that one of the major reasons for the Great Depression, why it became so severe, was the absence of a global leader. Earlier, Britain used to play that role, but now Britain was weak, and the United States, although strong, did not take responsibility. So there was no country to stabilize the global economy or the system. Now, after experiencing so much instability, countries realized that they needed a new international monetary system, one that would ensure stability but also allow flexibility. Now, countries tried to rebuild the global monetary system through what is known as Bretton Woods system. In Bretton Woods system, there were 44 countries. Now, imagine the situation in 1944. The world had gone through two devastating wars and a severe economic depression. Countries had realized one very important lesson, that without a stable international monetary system, global trade and economic growth cannot survive. So, in July 1944, 44 countries came together at a place called Bretton Woods in the United States. Their objective was very clear. They wanted a system that would provide stability like the gold standard, but also flexibility to handle economic problems which the gold standard failed to provide. Now, let us understand what exactly they created. At the center of the Bretton Woods system was the US dollar. The United States agreed to fix the value of its currency in terms of gold. Specifically, the US declared that 1 ounce of gold would be equal to US dollar. This means the dollar was directly convertible into gold at fixed rate. But here is the important point. Other countries were not required to convert their currencies into gold. Instead, they fixed their currencies to the US dollar. So, effectively, the system worked in layers: gold, dollar, and other currencies. Now, I can explain you in this manner. Suppose you have rupees, then these rupees were actually tied to dollars, and the dollar was then tied to gold. Now, you cannot convert rupees directly to gold. You have to first convert it to dollars, and then this dollar will be converted into gold. Now, the dollar has like 1 by 35 ounce was equal to $1. This was the value of dollar. So at the top we had gold, then gold was linked to US dollar at $35 per ounce, and then all other currencies were linked to the US dollar. So if you think carefully, the system was not a pure gold standard. It was actually a gold dollar standard, where the US dollar became the central currency of the world. Now, how did the system maintain this stability? Each country had to declare a fixed value of its currency in terms of US dollar. This value was called the par value. Once declared, the country had to ensure that its currency did not fluctuate more than 1% from its par value. So, here in this case, let us say $1 is equal to 40 rupees. Now, the $1, these 40 rupees was allowed to fluctuate 40 plus 1% of 40 rupees and 40 minus 1% of 40 rupees. That is, if we see, this comes as 39.6 and to 40.4. Now, this is a very tight band. If the currency started moving too much, the central bank had to intervene. For example, if the currency was becoming too weak, the central bank would sell dollars and buy its own currency. If the currency was becoming too strong, it would do the opposite. So, like the gold standard, where adjustment was automatic, here the adjustment was made primarily by the government. For example, if the central bank, let's talk about India, if central bank RBI buys dollar from the market, the supply of dollars will decrease. Giving boost to the price of dollar vis-a-vis rupees. And if RBI sells dollars in the market, the supply of dollars will increase, thereby reducing price of dollars. So in this way, they maintain the exchange rate stability. Now, as I told you that only when there were structural problems, then the currency was allowed to devaluate more. Fine. So, under the Bretton Woods system, countries were not allowed to devalue their currency frequently. However, if a country was facing serious and long term economic problems, what we call fundamental disequilibrium, then the devaluation was evolved. There was a rule here. A country could devalue its currency by up to 10% without taking permission. But if it wanted to devalue more than 10%, it needed approval from the International Monetary Fund or IMF. Now, for here also, like for example, we have $1 is equal to 40 rupees, then 10% of it, that means you can either go for $1 equal to 44 rupees. Fine. So that means 40 plus 10% of 40 rupees. So this was the maximum devaluation you can do. Now this brings us to another important feature of Bretton Woods, the creation of international institutions. Two institutions were established. The first was the IMF. Its role was to provide financial assistance to countries facing balance of payments problems and to ensure that countries followed stable exchange rate policy. Second, the World Bank, which was created to provide long term loans for reconstruction and development, especially after the war. Another important feature of this system was that countries were allowed to impose capital controls. This means they could restrict the flow of money across borders. This was done to protect the fixed exchange rate system from speculative attacks. Now, because of all these features, fixed exchange rates, controlled capital flows, and institutional support, the Bretton Woods system worked very well for nearly 3 decades. The period from 1945 to early 1970 is often called as the golden age of capitalism because global trade expanded, economies grew, and financial stability was maintained. But as we always say in economics, every system has its own internal problems. The main problem in Bretton Woods was related to the role of US dollar. Since all countries were using the US dollar for international trade and reserves, there had to be enough dollar available in the global economy. This meant that the United States had to continuously supply dollars to the rest of the world. How could it do that? By running balance of payment deficits. In simple terms, by sending more dollars out than it received. But this created a problem. As more and more dollars accumulated in foreign countries, people started asking a question. Does the United States actually have enough gold to convert all the dollars at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce? This conflict is known as Triffin's dilemma. On the one side, the US needed to supply dollars to keep global economy running. On the other side, supplying too many dollars reduced confidence in the dollar convertibility into gold. Now, by the late 1960s, this problem became very serious. Countries, especially in Europe, started converting their dollar reserves into gold. As a result, the gold reserves of the United States began to fall. Now, dollar was no longer convertible into gold. The system finally collapsed. Now, how it happened? Now, you have a gold reserve which is fixed, and this gold reserve is mainly in USA. Now, in order to give liquidity, USA has to print dollars. Now, too many dollars in the international market questions the convertibility of dollars into gold. Now, what should be the ratio? What should be the ratio or the price at which dollar can be exchanged for gold? Obviously, when there is large number of dollars, the gold reserve is insufficient to convert the dollars at the price of $1 is equal to 1 by 35 ounce of gold. Now, this is the problem. Now, it did not have that much of gold reserve and dollar was no longer convertible into gold. So finally, in August 1971, US President Richard Nixon made a historic announcement. He declared that the United States would no longer convert dollars into gold. This event is known as Nixon shock. With this decision, the foundation of the Bretton Woods system collapsed because the entire system depended on the dollar being convertible into gold. Now, after this collapse, countries were not ready to completely move to floating exchange rates immediately. So, they tried to save the system through an agreement known as Smithsonian Agreement in December 1971. Under this agreement, the value of the US dollar was officially reduced. Instead of $35 per ounce of gold, it was changed to approximately $38 per ounce of gold. At the same time, countries were allowed more flexibility. The exchange rate band was widened from plus 1% to 2.25%. This allowed currency to move more freely in response to market forces. Now, to understand how this system worked in Europe, we use a very interesting concept called the snake in tunnel and the worm in snake. Now, here, the tunnel, let's draw it and understand it in a better way. Let's say this is a tunnel. Now, this tunnel, the movement of the currency was plus minus 2.25%, right? Which means that the vis-a-vis dollars, the currency could move plus 2.25%, and from here if we consider it 0, minus 2.25%, creating a whole band of 4.5%. Now in this we also had snake in the tunnel, which was also, you can keep it like snake here. Now this snake was actually for the European countries, and they could fluctuate from plus 1 to 5% to minus 1 to 5% among each other. So the total band, if we say, for the fluctuation of the European countries among themselves was 2.50%. There was also one more concept of the worm in snake, which in which few countries pegged their currencies in such a manner that they could fluctuate 1%, plus 1 and minus 1% with each other. So obviously those countries which were trading heavily with each other were actually trying to balance, their exchange rate, and were keeping their exchange rate a little more stable as compared to the rest of the world, or we can say dollar. So here, hence the band was little tighter when it comes to worm or when it comes to snake. So here the tunnel refers to the wider band of plus minus 2.25% against the US dollar. So currencies could move within the range relative to the dollar. Within the tunnel, European countries tried to maintain even more stability among themselves. They allowed their currency to fluctuate only within a much narrower band of about plus minus 1.25% relative to each other. And the even tighter band, which we have already discussed before, was plus minus 1%, and this was between Belgium and Netherlands. So imagine this, a big tunnel representing the wider movement against the dollar, and inside it a smaller snake representing tighter coordination among European countries because they were trading a lot with each other. So they wanted a stability. More the stability, lesser is the foreign exchange risk. While some countries like Belgium and Netherlands went even further, they tried to keep their currencies even more closely aligned with themselves. Like we can see here, this is sometimes informally described as worm in the snake. Now, so we have three layers: tunnel, snake, and worm. However, despite these efforts, the system could not be sustained. The underlying economic problems were too strong, and countries found difficult to maintain fixed exchange rates. By the early 1970s, the world gradually moved towards a system of floating exchange rates where currency values are determined by market forces of demand and supply. So, if we look into the entire journey, we can clearly see the pattern. The gold standard provided stability but lacked flexibility. The Bretton Woods system tried to combine stability with flexibility, but it depended too much on US dollar. And when the trust broke down, the system collapsed. Today's system is more flexible, but it also brings its own challenges. That is why understanding the evolution is very important because it helps us understand why the international financial systems work the way it does today. Thank you.